Okay, Mike, you've given us some pretty reasonable changes to Tennessee, the SEC, and college football. We've gotten some answers that were just really outliers, but you've been pretty reasonable about it. So we're going to stop being reasonable because now we give you superpowers to jump into a time machine, go back in time, and change a result. It doesn't have to be a game, any decision, any result in the history of college football.
Okay, yeah, there's two. The two greatest travesties in the history of college football. December 1956, I would change the Heisman voting. The only player from a losing team to win the Heisman Trophy, Paul Hornung, absolutely undeserving. The West Coast voters hosed Johnny Majors. Johnny Majors lost by, I think, 72 total votes in the 1956 voting, all because he I don't even think he finished in the top 5 of the West Coast regional ballots. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely the greatest travesty in the history of college football, the 1956 Heisman voting. Greatest robbery ever. And then after I got done fixing that, I would go to December of 1997, and I would fix the second greatest travesty in the history of college football, and I would hand Peyton Manning the Heisman Trophy that he deserved. And then I would send a very nicely worded email to ESPN and let them know that their efforts at robbing Peyton Manning of his Heisman Trophy have been defeated by the time machine. So that's the first two things I would do, and those are pretty easy decisions. The absolute greatest two travesties in the history of college football: the 1956 Heisman voting award to Paul Hornung, who played on a losing Notre Dame team, the only player from a losing team to ever win the trophy, and then I would go back and fix the 1997 Heisman voting. I believe Peyton lost by about 250 votes in that voting as well. I would fix that one as well to rectify those two absolute travesties.
All right, Mike, for as much as I enjoyed the discussion typically, and now it's not a discussion, I'm just kicking back and listening to your responses to these questions about changing college football on a number of levels. First of all, you broke the rule like 3 out of 4 times. Even though the answers were very interesting, you changed a number of things. You got the opportunity to change one thing, and you selected like 2 or 3. But that's okay. So in the Heisman category, so you're looking not to change the results of championships or history within the Tennessee program or college football, anything that's bothered you. You're looking at individual awards, which is certainly your right to do within the question. But yeah, just to shed some light for our younger fans who are not necessarily historians, it's pretty ludicrous that Paul Hornung did win the Heisman Trophy. That team went 2-8. I told my son this a couple of weeks ago, and he just was flabbergasted that a player on a 2-8 football team won the Heisman Trophy. And number 2, when I told him that quarterback threw 3 touchdowns, he just couldn't believe it, because you think, well, the guy must have thrown 50 touchdowns, and we know it was a different age in football in regards to offensive systems, but still, he wasn't exactly tearing it up in any way, shape, or form, and they go 2-8. It's just inconceivable there. Charles Woodson, in my opinion, was the best player in college football in 1997, and he won a national championship and made the biggest plays on the biggest stages in those games to get his team to that point.
Well, notice I went to 56 first, and you know why Paul Hornung won the Heisman that year. In 1956, there were 2 schools with nationwide television contracts, Penn and Notre Dame. So it's the same argument that we're having today, 50, 60 years later. It's all about people being influenced by who they watch on TV, the big name programs, West Coast voters or the East Coast voters not seeing the West Coast players, and the West Coast players being at disadvantage, and so on and so forth. So I found it interesting that Penn and Notre Dame actually had nationwide contracts in the 1950s. And if you look at the voting, which I've done, I don't think Johnny Majors even was in the top 5 on the West Coast ballots. And of course, the Heisman voting is regional in nature. So notice I went to 56 first, because that's obviously a far more more egregious travesty than the Peyton Manning Heisman robbery, which is still egregious, but not nearly as much as Hornung beating Majors for the Heisman in 56. But I think the reason I went to the individual awards, Tennessee has had not what I consider their fair share of football success, but we've been blessed to have football success. We're a top 10 program, all-time wins, bowls, a couple of national championships, a couple more that we should have had. So when you play it on the field between these 85 players and those 85 players, unless there's a 5th down or just a horribly egregious call, you can't really complain about what happens on the field. But when you get something like the 56 Heisman voting, that's something that you really want to go back and fix for a guy who really deserved that. Who really, it was just it's how did that happen moment. So that's why I went with the individual award instead of something that happened on the field.
So, Mike, you're actually changing something that could have been changed. So most people are opting to change results, like plays that actually didn't happen would have to happen to change results of games. You're talking about taking the same performance on the field and just changing the minds of voters to make the right decision. And I understand the limitations in 1956 in regards to media and all of that and information, but if I place myself in 1956, I simply say, give me the AP top 25. I can see it right here. Okay, this is the top 25 teams in the country. Most likely my player is going to come from the top 25 teams in the country. Now give me the stat sheets of the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. And I'm sure that there were at least a dozen players with better performances than 3 touchdowns and 13 interceptions and like 12 rushing touchdowns for a 2-8 football team. It is one of the travesties in the history of sports awards. It's incredible. And I would have been able to answer your question about why Paul Hornung won the Heisman Trophy 10 years later, because he was a Green Bay Packer. He was the golden boy. He was a national hero. I didn't understand it until you just explained the TV situation with Hornung and all the acclaim, because at this point he was playing for a losing, albeit Notre Dame, a losing football team, and not playing statistically rather well. Obviously, he was a great player that turned out to be an NFL star and a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, he wasn't the golden boy in 1956.
No. All right, Mike Laval from Last Word on College Football, and it's always interesting to knock around some storylines that are off the beaten path and some theoreticals. All right, Mike, we appreciate the time.
Mark, always a pleasure.